Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. Today, we're going to start our short conversation about Australia and New Zealand. We are going to start with Australia today, and then we'll wrap up with a quick conversation about New Zealand on our next episode. So, thank you and welcome. Start with our learning targets. What are we going to be able to do today? Well, we're going to be able to look at the physical, the economic, as well as the cultural traits of Australia. Well, I certainly identify some of those. We're also going to get into some history, and we're going to specifically be able to talk about the history of Australia's first people, the Aboriginal people of Australia. So let's get started. Just kind of a brief overview. One of the things that makes Australia unique is that it can claim to be a continent, a country, and an island. It actually can be all three. And so when we look at it in comparison to the world, it's our sixth largest country in the world. It is quite large in size, and sometimes we forget about that because sometimes maps do distort a little bit, especially as we get closer to the poles. And of course, many of us know Australia as the land down under, and again, that's because of its location in the southern hemisphere. Australia is made up of 6 states and 2 provinces. So as far as states go, we'll start with, of course, here in the southeast, we've got New South Wales. From there, we've got Victoria, and then you move up into Queensland as you get to the northeast. You've got Western Australia, of course, in the west. And then from there, you've got South Australia. And then you've also got the island of Tasmania, which is off the southeast coast of Australia. It is, again, a state. Then you end up with 2 provinces. You've got the Northern Territory, again, large amounts of Aboriginal land here. And then you've also got, down here, you've got the Australian capital, which is Canberra, which we'll talk a little bit about towards the end of today. But let's get started with some physical geography. There is a lot of cool physical geography in Australia, and I'm excited to talk about it. So as far as our mountain ranges go, we've got what's called the Great Dividing Range. Now, unlike a lot of the mountains that we've been talking about, especially recently in Asia, these are pretty low elevation mountains. And so you're not going to see the large sweeping Himalayas like we've been talking about recently. And so certainly elevation is going to be much lower. But as pictured up here, you've got the Great Barrier Reef, and this would certainly be on my bucket list of places to see. It's over 1,250 miles long, and it's a coral formation off the northeast coast of Australia, and it looks just incredible. Host to a lot of variety of wildlife, but certainly, again, would be a very cool place to visit. Throughout the southern and southeastern portions of Australia, you're going to find a lot of what we would call, as far as landforms go, the plains. Very fertile soil. It's where most of the agriculture is going to take place in Australia. It's also where the majority of the people live. It's where some of your big cities like Sydney and Melbourne are located. As far as river systems, there's a couple of really big ones to keep in mind. The Murray as well as the Darling rivers. Again, they're both going to be very important for especially some of those early settlements in Australia, and certainly, of course, to the Aboriginal people. And then, of course, we can't talk about Australia and not mention the outback. The outback is an area typically more found towards the center of Australia, and it's this land region that is lined with what we call stations. These are mining camps, and again, we'll talk about some of the things that Australia mines, along with sheep and cattle ranches. In fact, one of these ranches is actually more than twice the size of the state of Delaware. So again, sometimes we underestimate just how large Australia really is. So kind of continuing, if we make it our way west, this is where you're going to be seeing deserts and plateaus. Certainly, you've got the Great Victoria Desert, the Gibson Desert, the Great Sandy Desert, and again, water throughout, especially this part of Australia, is quite scarce. But you do find important water sources like the Great Artesian Basin, which are deep underground pools. Now, because of Australia's location and certainly how, when we look at geology and how it moved Australia through, certainly plate tectonics, there's a lot of isolation for Australia, and this gave an opportunity for nature to create some unique species within this area. And specifically, one of the things that we might note are the presence of large amounts of marsupials. These are mammals that, of course, give birth to live young, but they carry that young in a pouch. And certainly some of the key examples that you'll find in Australia are kangaroos and wallabies. And when it comes to the economy of Australia, got a couple of very important industries. We'll start with mining. Okay, and you're again the outback, the mountain ranges. This is where you'll see a lot of this. Certainly, you're going to see iron ore. You'll see zinc, bauxite again, makes aluminum, gold, silver. You'll see opals, diamonds, pearls. So certainly some precious stones in there as well. You're also going to see that there's coal, certainly natural gas, along with oil. Those, of course, have helped to fuel parts of the economy in Australia. Agriculture-wise, you're looking at grains, sugarcane, cotton, fruits, vegetables, certainly a lot of agriculture going on. But one thing Australia can claim is that it is the world's top producer of wool. In fact, shearing sheep is a sport in Australia, and they are fantastic at it. It's actually quite interesting to watch, and none of the animals get hurt. And actually, it's good for them to have that wool shaved from them, as long as you do it carefully and try not to nick them. But manufacturing-wise, transportation equipment's a big one. You're going to see metals and cloth as well as chemicals, although certainly in recent years, Australia's service industries have grown considerably. Specifically, tourism is, of course, a really big one for Australia. You're also certainly going to see some high-tech industries that also continue to be important to the economy of Australia. Let's dive into some of the history here. So we can't tell the story of Australia without talking about Aborigines or Aboriginal people. And so these are the descendants of the first people to arrive in Australia. When they first arrive, likely probably from places like Polynesia, they arrived as hunters and gatherers, and they would search through the land to find water, and they would have developed tools for hunting animals such as the boomerang. And they would have arrived definitely over 40,000 years ago. So they had been in place for a long time. The Dutch are the first Europeans to arrive. They arrived in the late 1600s. But certainly the group that dominates Australian history is the British. This is a former British colony, much like the eastern United States, much like Canada, Belize, and certainly some of the other countries that we've talked about, including India. And Captain James Cook arrives and claims Australia for Britain. He does this in 1770. And Australia's first use for the British was actually as a penal colony for criminals. That's why there's so many Irish people here, or people of Irish descent. But certainly this is kind of the origins of Australia as far as the British history goes. Of course, we know the Aboriginal people had been here for centuries before then. But as the British establish more and they see the potential of Australia, they start to claim more and more Aboriginal land. And many Aborigines were killed by disease, again, much like we've seen in history around the world with colonization, including in the United States. Several native people are killed by European diseases. You also see that Aboriginal children were brought to boarding schools, and this is where children were taught English. They would wear European-style clothing. They'd be given English names, much like Native Americans had gone through a similar process in places like the United States. Also, certainly in Canada. In 1967, although at this point, the government does finally recognize Aborigines as full citizens of Australia. So certainly when you're noting the history, you'll want to note the beginnings with James Cook all the way through that government recognition of citizenship for Aborigines. Now, speaking of the government, it makes sense. We're in a former British colony. We're going to have a parliamentary democracy, much like we see in Canada, much like we saw in Belize. And so you do have a prime minister serving as the head of the government, and currently that is Scott Morrison. And this is, again, being filmed in the year 2022. The British monarch is still seen as having a presence, but it's mostly ceremonial. She, in this case, Queen Elizabeth II, is seen as a ceremonial leader in the country. And in recent years, you have seen some people in Australia wanting to move Australia to more of a republic as opposed to a parliamentary democracy, with the idea of having a president at its head, much like you would see in the United States, Mexico, or other countries that have republics. And so it'll be interesting to see if Australia does end up making that shift in the coming years, but as it stands right now, they remain a parliamentary democracy. They also have a federal system, much like we'd see in the United States. This is where you separate power between the national government and the state governments, and the Australian Constitution would certainly lay that out specifically, much like the United States Constitution does in the U.S. As far as Australians go, their numbers are around 25, 26 million people. Government has certainly encouraged immigration, and in fact, they have relied on immigration to fill a lot of their skilled working positions as a way of trying to, of course, help grow their nation. Australia is a very urban society. 90% live in cities, and Sydney and Melbourne are your largest cities. Again, Canberra is your capital. A lot of times when you ask people what the capital of Australia is, they want to say Sydney, but it's Canberra. So, great trivia question if you want to stump a friend. 10% then live in rural areas, or in Australia, they would say that they live in the bush. And typically, a lot of them work in those stations, either in the mining industry or in agriculture. And Aussies, as they refer to themselves as, do predominantly speak English, but you will hear several languages. Again, Australia is certainly a nation that is starting to change in its diversity. You've seen a lot of immigration from Asia and Pacific Islanders, but certainly also to even expats making their way to Australia. Again, those are people who are Americans who go to live abroad. So, of course, they're going to speak with an Australian dialect, which of course comes with its own word choice. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to wrap up this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. I highly encourage you to check out the check-in quiz just to make sure you're kind of picking up on some of those big ideas that we talked about and see if you can handle that challenge question. For my students, if you've got any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, for everybody, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time when we talk about New Zealand on Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography.